prizes, some of its main characteristics, and 4 of its most prominent artists. She'll conclude by showcasing what she believes to be the crowning piece of the movement. Please welcome Sydney Lindgren.
Hello, my name is Sydney Lindgren, and I would like to share with you a study that I conducted on Art Nouveau last semester for my class 19th and 20th century art history. But before I get into the specifics of the movement, I would like to give a brief overview of some of the characteristics and context of Art Nouveau. First of all, it began in the early 1890s, and this time period shaped the development of Art Nouveau in several different ways. However, one of the most prominent effects that it had was that the development of new printing technologies allowed artists to make different kinds of art in different mediums that they were never able to make before, such as in largely mass-produced posters and newspaper articles and book illustrations. It was just a very revolutionary time for artists in being able to distribute their art in many different ways across the country. Art Nouveau exploded across Europe and then moved towards America, and because of this large geographical range, it also resulted in a large range of mediums utilized by Art Nouveau artists. Some of these mediums included drawing, painting, poster design, architecture, furniture, interior design. Practically nothing was untouched by Art Nouveau artists. They were always revising the normal design of things. Some of the characteristics of the style of Art Nouveau include the use of curvaceous lines drawn from nature, as well as asymmetrical compositions that would promote a more dynamic compositional structure and emphasize movement, as we will see in some of the examples that I will show later, as well as the use of patterns and ambiguous space. In fact, the ambiguous space was often emphasized by the use of patterns because the figures were not very clearly in a certain place spatially, like they would have been in other art forms. Like many other art movements from around the turn of the century, Art Nouveau deviated from 19th century historicism, where artists would submit their work to a salon, and critics at the salon would review their work and decide whether their art piece was valid or not. Now, the Art Nouveau artists circumvented this process mainly by focusing on the more decorative and practical arts, which were not subjected to as much critical scrutiny. To give you an example of what the salon would have preferred, here are 3 paintings by Cabanel, David, and Bouguereau. They are two are from the academic movement, and the middle one is from the neoclassical movement. Now, just as an aside, the neoclassical movement was much earlier in the 1800s than the academic movement, where it's more applicable. But neoclassicism was very similar to the academic movement in what subject matter that they preferred and the style that they preferred as well. So it still relates to this example. As you can see with these examples, the subject matter that they preferred were important figures from Greek and Roman mythology, such as Pandora, important political figures and events, such as the consecration of Emperor Napoleon I, as well as important religious figures. Now, Art Nouveau artists mainly had a problem with these pieces, certainly not because of any craftsmanship issue, but because the subject matter and the style was so high and mighty that it was not accessible to the everyday viewer. They saw it as just being very aloof and not relatable to the everyday person. So to contrast this to, Art Nouveau artists then decided to focus more on things that were relatable to the everyday viewer, such as a cover for a Christmas magazine or depictions of the time of day, as you can see in these examples. They were just much more relatable, and they could be understood by the everyday viewer much more than the previous examples. A similar trend occurred within architecture as well. Here's an example of a building designed by Thomas Jefferson during the neoclassical period. We can see through this picture that it's a very symmetrical design. It's very formal. It's at the University of Virginia, and it was therefore meant to be more official and high and mighty and aloof. But it still has that same problem that the Art Nouveau artists had with the previous paintings. So then we see the contrast in what Art Nouveau artists decided to design. On the left, we see a doorway designed by Hector Guimard. It's a doorway to a hotel in Paris. So it's in a setting that is much more familiar to the everyday person, and because of the naturalistic design, it is much more relatable and closer to what many everyday people would feel comfortable with. As well, same kind of things with the Castle House picture from the interior. It's the interior of a townhouse. Now, they're still very heavily designed, so I can see some people saying, well, it still seems a little bit high and mighty and aloof, but when you're in these kind of situations and comparing the specific neoclassical and Art Nouveau things, there is certainly a transition, and this is a much homier feel than the grand pillars of neoclassicism and just the very official structures there. So, I would now like to give an overview of some of the more specific artists and provide some examples of what I believed to be some of the summarizing pieces of their artwork. And I will give some examples of how they fit into Art Nouveau, how the different aspects of their style and subject matter made them very much Art Nouveau artists. The first example I have is Aubrey Beardsley. Now, he was an Englishman, and this piece references his heritage in that it depicts a scene from Arthurian legend. He's one of the most famous artists from this movement, and he mostly illustrated for books during his career. And we can see that in this piece by the very sharp graphic style that he was limited to make it easier to print and reproduce these images. It's also black and white, which is another aspect of that. As far as the style that makes this very Art Nouveau, we can see the use of the curvaceous naturalistic lines that I talked about before, both in the bordering vine with the flowers around the edge, as well as in the many curvaceous lines within the characters' clothing, in their hair, and within the overall design. Ambiguous space is also used within this. It's not immediately recognizable, but we can see within the floorboards of the piece that the lines do not converge into a traditional one-point perspective that gives a very spatially grounded feeling in any picture, and therefore it makes it difficult to see where each of the figures are spatially within the picture. Also, the use of patterns is very much Art Nouveau. The flowers are repeated many times within the background, as well as in the dress and border of the picture. And those are the main things that made this a very Art Nouveau piece. Also, a other aspect of Art Nouveau that was present in many of the pieces, but not necessarily all of them, was that they would have a sensual tone, and from the title of this piece, we can see that as well with how Sir Tristram drank of the love drink. So now I'd like to move on to another famous Art Nouveau artist, Gustav Klimt. Gustav Klimt was Austrian, and he edges more towards the traditional academicism of his time. But he was separated both by his style, we can see the ambiguous space that he used, and I'll talk about a little more later, and mainly in his subject matter. It was rather offensive to many of the people in the salon, not only because of the very matter-of-fact depiction of the human figure, but also in his very conceptual subject matters, as we can see with the 3 ages of women, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. So with the ambiguous space, Gustav Klimt emphasizes this by the use of pattern in the background. The figures seem to be floating. They're not grounded in any particular space, and the patterns overlap each other in such a way that it's very difficult to tell where each of the figures are within the painting. It's also, as I mentioned, a rather matter-of-fact painting, but it is more potent because of this. Klimt hides nothing about his subject matter, whether it's the changes in the body of a woman as she ages, or in the changes of attitude and her emotions as it shifts from a contentment and youthfulness to a sadness and shame in nearing the end of life. This contrast is even emphasized within his use of patterns. As we can see with the young woman and her child, the patterns behind her are very springy colors and lively shapes. We have purples, yellows, blues, whites. It's just emphasizing how the 2 figures are in the spring of life, the youthfulness. However, then when we move over to the left side with the old woman, there's a drooping posture. We don't even see her face because she's covering her head. And the patterns are of deep reds and yellows and dark browns that emphasize her being in the autumn of her life, nearing the end. Also, one aspect of this that makes it Art Nouveau is the use of cropping, which, as I mentioned before, makes a dynamic composition. The top of the old woman's head nearly touches the top of the canvas as well, which I'll see in another Gustav Klimt painting. Just made a very different composition, it contrasted much with the very centered compositions of the neoclassical and academicist paintings that we saw before. Here's another example of an Art Nouveau artist. This is William Bradley, who was an American, and he worked mainly in printing from the beginning of his life. In his autobiography, he mentioned starting as a printer's devil as a 12-year-old in a printer shop in Ishpeming because he needed to support his mother in times of hardship when his father had died. But he continued to work in the printing business throughout his life, eventually becoming a graphic artist within that field. These, I believe, he made for a magazine, and his style is some of the most simplistic of Art Nouveau, and because of this, it is my belief that it is some of the most purely Art Nouveau. Here we can see dramatic use of curvaceous lines. They completely overtake the first piece with only 2 little feet popping out from the bottom. And they also are very prominent in the second piece, where it takes up a large portion of the composition as well. William Bradley was also very similar to Aubrey Beardsley, not only because of his printing style, but he was also very much inspired by Aubrey Beardsley's work and wanted to emulate his style in different ways, but also add his own little twist to them. We can see in these pictures that he utilized asymmetrical design very frequently as well, and each of the figures are also in ambiguous space. We cannot tell exactly where things are just because of the very flat background, but it also emphasizes the movement in this way. And the cropping, especially of the first picture, emphasizes the dramatic movement of this serpentine dancer with, I don't know if you've seen some of these, but it's just crazy how much they move these huge pieces of cloth around, and just emphasize the overwhelming nature of this dramatic movement. All right, here's another Art Nouveau artist. This is Alphonse Mucha. He's a Czech, and he was the first artist that made me interested in studying Art Nouveau. He has a very charming style, and the majority of his work is in posters. The majority of his work is in posters, and he therefore worked in series very often. And because of this aspect, it emphasized the daily craft and practical arts aspect of Art Nouveau. It was very marketable, it appealed to a large audience. We can see within these pictures that he used natural lines within the poses and the hair and many different aspects of the cloth as well. And it's still highly stylized. We can see that influence of the graphic line around the outline of each of the figures. And like Klimt, he uses a combination of flat and rendered subjects to emphasize an ambiguous space. We still aren't sure exactly where they are, but it's still a very pleasing composition, and they're grounded somewhat by the flowers in the bottom of the composition. So at this point in my research, I had seen so many different Art Nouveau pieces that it had become rather somewhat of a jumble. So I decided to try to find a piece that answered the question, if I had to explain Art Nouveau to someone with one piece of art, what would that piece of art be? And after much consideration, I decided on The Kiss by Gustav Klimt. Now, this painting emphasizes the different aspects of Art Nouveau in several ways. First of all, the extravagant use of materials highlights the commercial considerations of many of the Art Nouveau artists, although other Art Nouveau artists considered this by making their art very easily reproducible. Gustav Klimt used actual gold leaf within this painting and layered it on in the formation of the figure's clothing. The excessive patterns is also similar to previously mentioned artists and emphasizes the push and pull between flat and rendered subject matters, and also the natural curves of the vines and in the silhouette of the two figures is a trademark symbol of the Art Nouveau line work. Ambiguous space is also very prominent. The figures are somewhat rendered in their faces and in their skin, but the background is very flat with the use of patterns, as well as whatever ground they are standing on. It's not very apparent how they are even balanced on this strange composition. And but the background also emphasizes a dreamy atmosphere that is reinforced with the cropping and that same trend of making the figures touch the very top of the composition. Now, during the course of my study, I had the good fortune to stumble upon the St. Michael Cinema, where I found aspects of Art Nouveau in the style of this ticket booth and also in this poster, which is by Toulouse-Lautrec, another famous artist that I did not have time to talk about today. But in thinking about these settings, it was just such a strange place for me to see these Art Nouveau things. But in seeing them in such an everyday setting, it made me think about how these were everyday normal objects to these people. They would see them in newspapers, on posters around their city, in posters advertising plays, and they just saw them everywhere. It was not an unusual thing. But now, as people looking back at this history, we elevate them and talk about all of their amazing aspects. But so lastly, I'd like to challenge you to look for the subtle beauty and craftsmanship in our own world and just think about how people in the future may look at the things that we create and we think are just ordinary objects of the everyday and just marvel at how we made things in our own specific style, whether it's a logo that we click on every day to browse the internet, a poster that we see advertising a movie, or just the simple design of the buildings that we see in our cities or towns. Thank you.